What we talked about yesterday, we introduced narrative criticism as a discipline, as a sub-discipline of literary criticism, and then narrative criticism in the context of biblical studies, how biblical scholars apply narrative criticism to their work. And now we're going to apply it more directly to our work, to translation, Bible translation, in the context of producing a first draft. That's the context of using this narrative criticism, using oral and written mediums of communication. Think of it as the exegetical phase of the drafting process, with a strong emphasis on the oral, collaborative nature of the exegesis, of the study, of the inquiry. There are two scenarios that we can consider for this, using narrative analysis, written oral processes, in generating a first draft. The first example is what I'm calling this morning a pre-translation project, in which the goal is to produce an oral first draft. One that can either be told live in a live oral narrative performance, or can be recorded on audio. One of those two. But the product is an oral draft of the narrative. That's the first scenario. That's the scenario in which we use this method. The goal is to produce an oral draft, one that can be heard purely. You're not relying on written. The second example that we'll discuss later is one in what we would call a conventional translation project, in which the goal is to produce a written first draft. This same method, using both oral and written mediums, produce both kinds of products, if you will. One is oral, one is written. Again, the emphasis on there does not need to be the sharp divide between orality and written. We need to recognize, I would propose, that they exist together. The advantages of both should be taken advantage of, and the limitations should be acknowledged for them. Very simply put, an advantage of this kind of a project over here is you don't have to wait 5 or 10 years for a written product in order for people to have immediate access to a draft. We're not talking about a final authorized version of the biblical message. Over here, producing it in writing will assure a certain kind of rigor that goes into it and longevity into the future. And when it's written, in many cases it can be mass mediated in ways that a live performance can't, unless of course it's put on the internet. So there are advantages quickly and disadvantages to both. It used to be historically, the last 30 years in modern Bible translation movements, that oral productions of narratives were done at the end of a project. The translation was done, an audio version was produced from it. Why was the audio version produced? Because the written was not being accessed. Now, after 20, 30 years of this process, it's actually being put around in the front of the process. There was no need to wait, because there now is a drafting method that allows for an adequate production of the narrative discourse, and one that involves the community earlier, which, as you know, community motivation in a translation project is key. What is the point in having 1 or 2 or 3 people produce a Bible that the community is not motivated or mobilized to be a part of? That's not translation. Translation is indeed a social phenomenon. So we're going to focus now, this session, on the first scenario, example 1, where the goal is to produce an oral first draft. The exegetical method in this movement, I guess you would say, is called internalization. That's the term that they use. This kind of method calls it internalization, where the study, the exegesis, the point of it is to make it internalized in the people that are drafting the discourse, the narrative discourse. It's part of deepening an understanding so that the translation, so that the draft is more informed. The old adage, you can't translate something that you do not understand, is countered here in trying to deepen, to try to digest, to internalize, to study deeply, intimately the story, to know it well. And in this case, we'll privilege oral drafting. Going to show a about a 10-minute video of the section called internalization. Let me just quickly get it set up here. I don't know how loud this is. Okay, that's not loud at all.
Again, this second television story marks the beginning of an intense, morning-long period of study.
Okay, thanks. Let me set it up a little bit. What you're going to be seeing is a group of 6 languages. Each language has at least 3 people on the team. They're all in the same room. Someone stands up and tells the story from memory. They have internalized it themselves prior to the meeting. Then a discussion is led, an oral discussion, completely oral discussion on the story, following the various domains of inquiry we were introduced yesterday. Character, the various settings are discussed, the plot is discussed, the themes are discussed, the actual structure of the story, the climaxes or the peaks in the story, the difficult terms and concepts are discussed in a group. We would call them key terms in a written project. They called it, in this context, difficult words to understand, difficult expressions to understand, difficult concepts to understand. That's part of this 3-hour-long discussion. That's how long it will take to do this. So you're only going to get a very, very, you're just going to go. You'll just sniff it a little bit, okay? But I want to introduce you to the basic structure of it. That's the point of this. You'll hear 3 terms that are kind of quirky to this method. One is they refer to people who are the facilitator trainers. That's the person who tells the story and leads the discussion, leads the internalization process with questions. That's that person's role. The next role is they're called storyteller crafters. Think of them as the translators. They're the people who will hear and digest and understand the story and then begin to draft in the mother tongue, orally, with the help of audio technology. We don't want to forget that is part of the process. It allows, what is writing, if not at least a memory aid, right? Help to remember. Well, so is a recording as a technology. It is a form of a memory aid. It's more than that, but it's at least that kind. It functions that way at least. And then they draft and tell it orally, just like you would do in a normal checking session, a normal drafting session, until it sounds orally right. And then a final recording is made, and that's called the first draft. Okay? So I'll play this for you. We just want to get familiar with the structure. And there's, one other player, the story checkers. Think of them as the consultants, those who do the checking session when this is finished. We won't observe any of that here. So the process, the exegetical process, is called internalization. This morning-long period of study is called the internalization process. The internalization process is the heart of the OBS method.
L'appropriation. Parce que pour pouvoir narrer cette histoire, il faut se l'approprier. Et comme je l'ai déjà expliqué en d'autres...
Okay, we all know what's next now, what follows. Each one of us will soon tell a new Bible story. But first, we are going to do the internalization. That is, in order to be able to learn to tell a new story, we first need to internalize it. The process of internalization provides a way, a method, for us to digest the story, to personally incorporate it into our own lives.
L'histoire en question. Ça devient notre propre histoire.
During each OBS internalization session, OBS trainers and storyteller crafters methodically identify, discuss, and internalize key elements of each new Bible story. They discuss the story's characters, context, plot, twists, and main ideas, as well as difficult words, expressions, and concepts. The internalization process begins as the facilitator trainer guides the mother tongue storyteller crafters in a lively group discussion of all the characters in the story.
Nous commençons par les personnages.
Okay, let's begin with the characters in the story, sometimes discussing them together in this large group, and sometimes separately in each of our language groups. Okay? Everybody ready? Shall we begin?
As a group, participants describe and discuss what they know about each character, based upon what that character does, what that character says or thinks, or what the narrator or other characters in the story say or think about that character. As the storyteller crafters gain a better understanding of the motivations, attitudes, feelings, and thoughts of each of the story's characters, they become better equipped to more effectively translate, craft, and retell the story of these characters in their mother tongue. After discussing the story's characters at length, the facilitator trainer then guides the mother tongue storyteller crafters in a discussion of the general context of the story. Participants consider relevant geographic contexts, social contexts, cultural contexts, religious contexts, political contexts, and economic contexts. After discussing the story's context, the facilitator trainer then guides the mother tongue storyteller crafters in a discussion and internalization of the story's plot.
Nous allons donc continuer cette appropriation avec les autres étapes. Nous avons déjà vu.
We are going to continue the internalization process with the other steps in the process. We have already considered the characters and the context, and now we are going to discuss what? The plot. Shall we discuss the plot? Let's discuss the plot. The different subdivisions of the story. How the story is organized. We'll do that together and in our different language groups, so that each one of us will be able to recount what comes before and what comes after what.
The plot of the story may be internalized in a variety of ways. For example, the facilitator trainer may simply retell the story. Then, the storyteller crafters, in turn, retell the basic sequences of the plot in the language of wider communication to the entire group. Alternatively, each storyteller-crafter may also retell the basic plot of the story in his or her mother tongue to all of the other storyteller-crafters in his or her language team.
Puisque vous êtes quatre par langue en dehors de IASA,
Now retell the plot, 2 by 2 in your mother tongue, not in French, in your mother tongue. Tell your neighbor, recount to him, all of the sequences of this story, from the beginning to the end, in your mother tongue. As soon as you are finished, he too tells you the story's plot, from the beginning to end, always in the mother tongue. Each one should do so with his neighbor, in the mother tongue. Let's go.
Allez, on y va.
OBS also employs visual methods of internalizing a story's plot through storyboarding or human tableau. A popular visual method entails an impromptu dramatization of the story. The story's cast of characters is spontaneously composed from among the workshop's participants. Costumes and set are improvised. The entire dramatization is then narrated by the facilitator trainer or by a brave volunteer from among the storyteller crafters.
Jésus dit dans sa langue, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
In the process of telling and retelling the plot of a story, the trainer and the storyteller crafters occasionally discover that certain sequences in the plot still seem vague or even confusing. In such cases, workshop participants may discuss and propose alternate ways to reorder those sequences so as to render them more coherent to their audience. After discussing and visualizing the story's plot, the trainer then guides the storyteller crafters in a discussion of the unexpected twists and turns in the story. These discussions of a story's twists and turns are followed by a discussion of the story's main ideas and themes. During an OBS workshop, group discussions of a story's principal themes are often passionate, a sign of the story's growing personal impact on the workshop participants. The discussions of a story's twists and themes are followed by a brief exploration of ways in which the opening and closing of the Bible story at hand might be effectively adapted for a live storytelling event. Often, for example, listeners cannot readily understand some elements of a Bible story if they do not already know certain relevant elements from other Bible stories. To remedy this problem, many OBS storytellers judiciously include the needed information in the opening of their story. By the final step in the OBS internalization process, participants have discovered certain words and expressions in the story that are plainly difficult to understand and will certainly be problematic to express in their mother tongue. The facilitator trainer then guides the participants in a discussion of the likely interpretations of those terms.
Take the phrase at mid-morning. There isn't a phrase like mid-morning in your language? Right. For mid-morning, one could say 9 o'clock.
Each team then searches for natural ways to communicate those terms in their mother tongue. The facilitator trainer proposes a few basic translation principles to guide the teams in their search. The teams have now begun the shift away from recounting the story in a language of wider communication toward a complete retelling of the story in their mother tongue. By the end of each OBS internalization session,
OBS trainers and storyteller crafters have methodically identified, discussed, and internalized many of the key elements of a new Bible story. The story's characters, context, plot, twists, climax, main ideas, opening, and closing, as well as several problematic words and expressions. Each team is now better prepared to orally craft and retell that story in their mother tongue.
So that's an overview of this internalization process. From those processes normally end at the end of the morning before lunch. It's a very short time, 3 hours. And then in the afternoon, the entire afternoon is spent retelling the story. They've already done that a few times in the morning, two by two in the mother tongue. And in the afternoon as a group, they'll continue to do that, but record what they're doing as they're going to help them put long chunks together of discourse, listen to larger segments of discourse together, and critique it, these larger discourse sections as to their flow, the coherence of these larger discourse communications, these larger discourse forms. I'll just show you a very, very short version of that process. You'll notice that they can use a very inexpensive audio recorder. They can use a cell phone. They use their computers, but they need something to hold together to remember these larger discourse, chunks of discourse, and to be able to comment on it as a group.
To begin an afternoon Bible story crafting session, each language team goes to separate rooms. There, they listen to the entire story again. They may listen to an audio recording of the story as it was told and recorded earlier that morning, or someone in that language team may simply retell the story to the others. Then, either section by section or in its entirety, the storyteller crafters retell the story out loud in their mother tongue. As they retell the story in their mother tongue, they critique their choice of words and revise their retelling accordingly. Once the whole language team is in agreement with their revisions, the story is retold and recorded. After the storyteller crafters have successfully retold and recorded the story in their mother tongue, they listen to the entire recording and revise and edit as seems necessary. Some storyteller crafter teams may not finish their mother tongue crafting in one afternoon. They may work into the night or longer. As each language team finishes recording their first orally drafted translation of a Bible story in their mother tongue, backup copies of the audio recordings are made and digitally filed. These files will serve as the reference texts from which back translations will soon be made. They will also serve as the reference texts to be orally checked the following week by an OBS story checker.
There are other steps. Yes, Marlon.
Just a quick question about the procedure to select the translators. Were they selected from who are already doing written translation, or just selected from the churches?
Well, usually in this setting here, I can only speak for this with certainty, is that maybe a year or so was spent by the Bible translation agency there with the community, asking the church leaders after a long discussion and a discussion about what should we translate and why should we translate that, to send the people that they thought were best suited to it. They were encouraged to consider a breadth of types of people, that if it was truly collaborative, that they wouldn't have to be highly literate. Someone on the team should be. Someone very, a pretty solid academic education, down to someone who may not be that strong, but who is very gifted in speaking, someone who can make a good judgment as to the art, the verbal art of the culture. Men, women, young, old, to try to build a group of people that can collaborate together, not by themselves writing in a room, all isolated. So these people will practice these and then go and tell them in their community. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that checkers may be called as consultants. Yeah, are there any, in this case, what were the qualifications to become a checker?
Well, in this case, they were accredited translation consultants. One was an SIL consultant, and I forgot where the consultant, I think he was from CAR. They were part of, I think in both cases, one was SIL and one was Seed Company. And they both had been accredited as consultants on normal written translations, but they were trained in especially how to do oral checking, how to not have to have a printed document in front of them in order to listen to a story and pose questions just like you would in a normal written session. So in this case, it's not always the case. There are checkers who are not accredited. That's up to that Bible society or translation agency to determine their level of experience and training. But in this case, both of these were consultants.
Just a question for clarity. So we're not talking about them doing like the whole book of Mark. We're talking about like a story.
Well, yeah, okay, this is fair enough. We can go there. A project normally takes 2 or 3 years. Over a period of 2 or 3 years, they will probably come up with a body of, I don't know, it can range 25 stories, give or take 20, or, it can be far more than that if you want. The point of this is not to, you could make the project segments of an entire gospel, for example. All of which, in my opinion, is the training ground, a training ground for a long-term translation project that would go for many years. These tools of internalization can serve as an exegetical model for translation teams. So some of the people that they send are already involved in a written translation. And they benefit from the unique method that this is. Some people start in this kind of a project, and because of their apparent gifts, move into a written project, either immediately if it's already going on, or eventually when a written project is launched. So you see again the back and forth between written and oral media is part of the training, that they see advantages to this. You might say in conventional circles, at least, an emphasis on trying to produce natural texts. That is an emphasis on it. There are a variety of those kinds of things, but
has it been tried with non-narrative genre?
Yes, it has. I'm not as familiar with that as others are. Jim and Janet, I'm sure, are familiar with that kind of a thing. I've chosen not to go into those waters today. I've chosen to limit it to narrative discourse because I've seen it and I have confidence in it, but hortatory discourse, and there's debate about how you would go about doing this, but this is safe ground here, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, am I wrong to assume that the oral draft should not be expected to look like the written conventional draft eventually?
Let me say no. What would you think would be a difference? What would, as you put it, wouldn't look like? What do you mean by that? What would you expect would be a difference?
Well, because the regions are different.
Yeah, but what if you transcribed the discourse, wrote it down, that they would say, what would you expect might be some differences?
Well, discourse markers, perhaps?
Yes, they might be different, right? But is it possible that a written translation might not have some of the discourse markers that they discovered in the oral that they should have had in the written?
Say it again.
Is it possible, this is what I see, oftentimes written translations, especially drafts, miss markers, especially between sections, connectors, for example. But in this process of producing it orally, it's harder to not put the markers in. I mean, that's what you're implying, that in an oral delivery, oral mediation of the discourse, those kinds of things are more likely to happen. And it's one of the easier ways, from my observation, to teach the use of markers and its place in written texts.
I don't want to speak for him.
Yeah, help me in case I'm missing something.
I don't want to speak for him, but I think that he might also mean that there are certain features that are intrinsic to orality. Let's say idiophones. In an oral translation, you would immediately use that, I guess. But maybe if you are going to produce a written translation, you might think, I don't agree with not putting them, but I'm saying normally people would say, well, let's put them less or not put them at all, while in oral you would be doing that.
Right. Yes, you will, I mean, a good translation brief, okay, you have to have that first. How can you make a critical judgment if you don't know the purpose and the audience? So there is no one-size-fits-all translation. So you decide on the purpose, you decide on the audience, and then the decisions as to whether to leave the idiophone in, or take the idiophone out, or put that marker in, or take that marker out is based upon your goals, your stated goals in the translation brief. A translation brief is translation. You're already limiting or opening up your decision-making choices already. And some people might see that as a hindrance, and some people might see that as a help, but in my opinion, it is a help, especially if as much of the community is involved as possible, so the expectations are being met. Because people will argue about an abstract translation as if they all were the same, as if one served all audiences in every situation. So, even in this case, for example, I would say a great tendency is in the first drafting of a discourse is that they will still leave out the idiophones. You assumed that they would. Why would they leave out the idiophones? If their tradition has a solid use of idiophones, why would the drafters not use those idiophones in their natural tellings?
It's the Bible.
It's the Bible. And what's the Bible to them? A written thing. Do we see idiophones in Bibles? Not normally. Philip Noss put them in when he first did them in Central Africa. But you understand, again, this back and forth between written and oral is always going on in people's heads. And part of the problem is we don't think of the Scopus theory, of the translation brief. Who is the audience? What is the purpose of this thing? You cannot make the judgment if you don't know who your audience is and you don't know what your purpose is. And if you know that it's going to be oral, for example, then, for example, in these kinds of projects, what I do is I ask for recordings of their traditional narratives, of their ways of telling story. We listen to those, we bathe ourselves in listening to those narratives before the drafting happens. People are more inclined to include their normal discourse features, having listened to them. My point is that this going back and forth between written and oral is something that all of us need to come to grips with. We talk about naturalness, right? In the Katie Barnwell example I gave, in the Bible Translation Basics book we gave, there's always oral drafting, all of which, most of the time, it's under the heading of naturalness, how to make the translation more natural, if you will. It's part of the process. All this, what we're discussing today, is a more expanded method for orally drafting. It's a way to talk, discuss in a more structured and what seems to be a helpful way, an order. You have to start somewhere, right? When you do a draft, you got to decide where you're going to start. So this is a place to start with the story in its entirety, but then focusing on characters, setting, plot, climax, main ideas, key terms, etc., etc., etc. Then if you want to turn to historical critical methods to find out what was happening in the chapters before this story and what they're foreshadowing in the chapters that will come after, fine enough. But you can't start with everything. You can't do all that in the beginning. You have to start somewhere. So this method proposes, at least to experiment, this simple approach. And once people get used to it, the process is quite easy. You heard the young man here say, "We all know what's next," he said, meaning we've done this exegetical process before. Let's get going and not waste so much time figuring out what we have to talk about. And then they move on in their exegetical process. Now, this morning's exercise actually is not oral. Again, you will remember, narrative criticism had these domains that they chose to speak of, right? So you see that this is happening in both cases. They're not consulting books, they're having a discussion with this as the structure to the discussion. However, even with this strong oral component in it, we remember the statement that I drew your attention to earlier. When we look at the history of orality studies, we see this strong coexistence between written and oral forms of communication. They do things together. They feed off each other. They fight with each other a little bit. And it happens here as well, because when the young man stood up to tell the story and lead the discussion, he had to have already internalized it himself. What do you suppose he did to do that? He read the Bible story. He read it first. He consulted commentaries. With these questions, what do the commentaries say about the characters? Who are they? Who is this character? Sociologically, religiously, economically. The setting, the plot. I tended, when I did this, to turn to translator's notes as a normal practice. It often answered many of the pertinent questions about many of these domains of inquiry here. So just as you would turn to paratext, to the normal commentaries and helps and translation aids, you also prepare yourself to lead a discussion. How can you lead a discussion about something you know nothing about? You should be the person who is engaged with it more than anyone else is. Now, I'm not saying tell everybody what to think. I said lead a discussion based around questions. Lead a discussion based around questions about who are the characters? What do we know about them? Not this is what you should know about the characters. Those kinds of things. That's not exegesis. Exegesis is a search. You help these people search.
So the output is either recorded videos or audio of these stories, which are then played in community settings.
Yeah, or delivered live.
Or delivered or performed.
Yeah.
Do you have any anecdotes about impact?
Oh, yes.
About that? Like,
Oh, yeah, there are lots of, I can briefly say,
yeah, just one or two things.
there are places to turn to for impact. Yes, it does mobilize communities. Is it the latest and greatest? Does it work everywhere? I don't know. I've not been everywhere. But I have listened to a number of people go through this. Last week we were here as a group of people doing what was called, a term that I was not happy with, oral Bible translation. But the basic gist of it is there were a number of people that had witnessed the impact of people hearing biblical discourse and the impact that had on the entire translation process. And it was favorable. So, favorable. Is it a silver bullet? No, I doubt it. But again, when we think it's just a novelty, let's do the real thing, the written thing, and then add on a few audio things later on. I think that is, I think it's missing reality, what research is showing us. These things happen together. Just because we're focused on the written doesn't mean the oral is not happening. My mother and father went in to buy a home once, and they walked out of the house after looking at the same house, and my mother only talked about the colors of the walls inside and how she wanted to paint them differently. My father only talked about how bad the plumbing was and how he wanted to fix that. Because of who they are, they perceived and recognized what they wanted, what they were tended to look at. We tend to look at a text. Fair enough, I love the text. I'm not taking away from the text. But this other thing happens at the same time. The question is do we do it adequately, well enough, with any art at all to it? Is there some structure to it? That's a question. Now, so there is a written preparation for this. I don't know, did you guys invent this, trainer's notes?
Pretty much, but it was influenced by others who were doing something sort of similar.
Okay.
But the point was that people would have access to this
Right.
key information at their fingertips.
Right. So this is a template to guide the exegetical process. So with this template, these questions about theme, character, context, plot, climax, here it is. I'm looking through translators' notes. I'm looking through a number of commentaries to help me understand all these. I've read through the story 100 times. I'm telling the story to myself in bed. I'm telling myself the story on the bus. I'm listening to a recording that I made of myself telling the story. I'm internalizing this. I sought the same translation aids as any written translator would do in preparation for this discussion. I can't lead a discussion, I can't lead a discussion about a film I've never seen before. I need to familiarize myself with it. And so this, with this template in hand, for example, here's one, the trainer's notes for the story of the time that Jesus forgave and healed the paralytic. You remember that story? So in that story, on this piece of paper, On this document, you can see that the characters are discussed. They're named, background information about who the characters are, contextual information about the characters, social, cultural. Over here, you'll see the context is dealt with. Maps are consulted. Where is Galilee? Where is Capernaum? What does a house look like in Capernaum where all of this happened? Where did I get that? From the same aids, translation, commentaries, aids, as any written person would do, only with these predetermined questions, this outline, this framework of inquiry. The plot, the order of things. The translation aid will talk, translator's notes will often point out confusing sequences, shifts, and those kinds of things. Similarly, this is filled out. The climax of the story or peaks, discourse, features of the story are talked about. Main thematic ideas, the twists in the story. I don't have time to get into all that. Reordering, openings, endings, difficult words, think key terms when you see that kind of a thing. So this document is really just an excuse for the person who will lead the discussion to familiarize themselves, to exegete the story. It's not something for them to fill out to give to somebody. It's to help them be prepared to lead the story. And when they do it, when I do it at least, and I know when Jim and Janet do it, there's no paper in front of them. I don't put that paper in front of them. I do this exercise, and I learn the story, and then I lead the discussion with them. I'm not glued to the paper. I'm exploiting the strengths of oral communication. I'm exploiting those strengths, the interpersonal strengths of them, the collaborative advantages of this kind of process. So our exercise to begin now, what time are we working on here? And we'll continue to work on in the afternoon. We'll do more after the coffee break. Now is to begin to fill out trainer's notes yourself for a story that you choose. So let me go. You can find this on Canvas. You can open up Canvas here. Go to the schedule for the week. The first session, the 9 to 10:30 session. Click on the link. And the instructions for the exercise are there. I'm going to read them aloud. Choose a brief biblical narrative to exegete and narrate. In other words, perhaps you're in the middle of a gospel now. Choose a pericope from it. Not too long, not too short. Perhaps you know something in the future that you will want to do. Perhaps you've already done something and want to see how this process may have helped you before had you already used it. So think of a biblical narrative, Old Testament, New Testament. I would suggest not too long. Jesus calming the storm, birth narrative, maybe even one of the episodes from the Passion, any number of things from the book of Acts, any narrative, okay, and then follow these steps. You prepare to lead a discussion of these things, the characters, the setting, the plot, twist, climax, main of that story. First, you're going to consult biblical commentaries. Which one will you turn to for that text? I'm assuming all of you know where your tools are for each of the different kinds of narratives. And then, using these trainer notes, you saw those earlier, I'll click on it for you. Using this as your basic guide. Maybe I should click this. Whoops. That's the template there. You can all download this, download that, that document. And then similarly, if you want to model, if you want to see how I completed one of these for me, I didn't complete it for my boss. I completed it for me in order to be ready for a discussion. And that's this one here. You click on that and you can download that as well. And it shows you this document. Oh, you can't see any of that.
You need to leave your presentation.
Yeah, I was a little slow on the uptake there. So I wasn't showing you anything before? Oh, great. Roy, why don't you save me from that? Okay, here is my trainer's notes, my exegetical preparation for this story here, and I just filled out what I thought was pertinent information for each of those categories so that I was ready for the discussion. So any kind of romantic idea about orality is to me erroneous. Okay? I looked at books before I talked. You know? But what was before the books? There was orality before the books. So this whole iterative process in our history, in our own work, is there. So that's the assignment to begin on now. Use that template. Use my notes as a model. Choose your story. I would say right now, choose a story and post it right here in the discussion. Tell me what your what story you're going to treat, and then begin treating it. You all have your paratext in front of you, right? You have access to it, so you know what your exegetical resources are. And you have 20 versions of the story on paratext. Choose what you think, 2 or 3 that you think will be helpful. Read through them and fill out the template for that story. So you can begin to do that. I'll give till 10:30, 20 minutes now, and then I'll give a little bit more time this afternoon. Roy?
In terms of organizing, we'll do that. Tony's here to give information about breakout rooms. Do you want to discuss where they should do this?
Yeah, what I'll do is that we will break out in the next session. I didn't ask for any breakout rooms for this one, but for the next session, after the coffee break, you can take them to their rooms after I explain what we're going to do. Okay? So that'll take a little bit of time. Right now, you can do all your work from here. Yes? Yes.
Out of curiosity, how long did it take you to prepare this one?
You are a rascal. Let me see. Way longer than it should have. It depends on how afraid I am of the people I'm standing up in front of. You know what I mean? I know that in many cases, they're going to know the story better than me, and, I'm supposed to be the director in the thing, and I don't even know the Bible. I haven't done my homework for it. I mean, just like any consultant, when you prepare to go doing a checking, you're scrambling around, aren't you? You're going through the whole story again, and you're consulting this and that and the other thing. But it's because the story's fresh for them. The translation team is deep into it. They're thinking about it. They've thought about these things. And you want to be ready. So normally, too long. I would say, honestly, two or 3 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm used to the process, right? You're not going to be used to this process. It's going to feel unnatural to you. It's going to feel, like a homework assignment. But after a while, and especially after you've led discussions, you begin to realize, I'm reading information that's not important. I got to imagine what people are going to be asking, what their questions might be about these things. Anticipating key terms. I mean, you have to anticipate this. The section on the key terms, I had to guess what I thought was going to be problematic for this language, for the people that would hear this story. Just like you do, really. I mean, when you have a narrative in front of you, a passage in front of you, there isn't a hard and fast list for the key terms. I mean, they propose something, but every people, you don't know what's going to be problematic. And you only know that after they've heard the story. They cannot know what individual words may or may not mean outside of a larger discourse. It's always contextual. So begin to do this exercise. Make sure you try to pick a narrative that interests you, something that you could maybe imagine that one day you might retell orally in another setting. You're a storyteller, you want to do this to get ready for that storytelling. And if you think storytelling, the word like storytelling, is unserious and just for children, then call it a narrative performance. Call it an oral, a biblical narrative performance. Did Jesus do it? Yeah, he told parables. Okay? So, choose a story well, begin to fill out the trainer's notes for it. And then you'll see the rest of the directions will tell you to submit that to me when you're finished.